and say welcome to panel 3, which is Poetics of Interiority, Madness, Pain, and Thought. I am Elizabeth Sagaser and am delighted to introduce our panelists, though I'm very sorry to learn last night that Amy Nestor is currently unwell and will not be presenting, so hoping that she feels better soon. I'll introduce our two present panelists now so their talks can follow one after another. So first we'll have Vanessa E. Cook, who is presenting a talk, Hamlet Wavered for All of Us, Dickinson, Shakespeare, and the 19th-century alienists. Vanessa holds an MA from Cambridge University in English Literature and an MST in Gender Studies from Oxford University. She is currently completing a doctoral dissertation at University College London on Emily Dickinson and 19th century psychology. That should be terrific. She lives in Berlin. And our second panelist is Philip Pardee. He will be presenting a talk, Stop Just a Minute, Let Me Think, Dickinson, Shakespeare, and the Poetics of Thought. Incredibly rich topic. Philip Pardee is the author of Meditations on Rising and Falling from University Wisconsin Press, which won the Brigham Poetry Prize and the Writers League of Texas Award for Poetry. His poems, translations, and essays have appeared widely in journals and anthologies such as Introduction to the Prose Poem, Best New Poets, and Is This Forever or What? Poems and Paintings from Texas. His latest project, recently completed with funding from the National Endowment of the Arts, is a volume of translation, A Better Language, Selected Poems of Claudia Lars. He teaches at Bard College. So now we will listen to our first talk, Amy Nestor.
Can you all see the screen okay? Yeah. Can you see the screen?
I think
yeah,
so.
it could be a bit bigger, maybe.
Yeah, I will.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
When Thomas Wentworth Higginson's wife was seriously ill in the summer of 1877, Dickinson sent her a note and enclosed a small white flower, a Cape jasmine. Dear friend, she wrote, I send you a flower from my garden. Though it dies in reaching you, you will know it lived when it left my hand. Hamlet wavered for all of us. Here Dickinson invokes and emphasizes Hamlet's universality, or rather the universality of his wavering between life and death, and between action and inaction. She also seems to echo Ophelia here. Like Shakespeare's heroine, Dickinson gives the gift of a flower, an emblem of what Ophelia calls love and remembrance. Shakespeare shows her handing out flowers, distraught at the sudden death of her father. Dickinson's father had died a few years earlier, as she told Mary Higginson in her first letter to her. And she is gifting consolation here and acknowledging the fragility and the brevity of life to which we are all subject. Though it dies in reaching you, you will know it lived, conveys the sense, as Parrot Finnerty suggests in his book on Dickinson's Shakespeare, that without dying, our lives and our stories, Hamlet's story, Ophelia's story, our stories, would not have been possible. Death lends life meaning in this sense, a tragic meaning that in Hamlet's case endlessly proliferates. His story, perhaps especially in the 19th century, has been endlessly retold. And what I'd like to explore today are some of the ways in which Dickinson retells Hamlet, in which she participates in the 19th century cultural practice of invoking Hamlet as a common touchstone, and to situate these in the context of contemporary Anglophone psychology and alienism. The generalizability of Hamlet's mental activity was a cultural truism in her day, and we see this, for example, in Ralph Waldo Emerson's work, and he refers to the 19th century as a sort of living Hamlet in its speculative genius. An American and British psychologist contemporary to Dickinson frequently drew on Shakespeare's characters. Hamlet was a firm favorite in conceiving their theories of the mind and their treatments for the mentally ill. And perhaps surprisingly, in the middle decades of the 19th century, Shakespeare seems to have been cited more than any other figure as an authority on mental activity and insanity. We may wonder at a time when psychologists were making efforts to gain greater legitimacy and acceptance for their work as a science, why they turned so often to the work of a dramatist, a creative artist, in conceiving their theories and treatments. And part of the reason for this, I think, is the generalist culture of the Victorian era and the effort psychologists made to reach as wide an audience as possible. And the historian Rick Rylance discusses this in his study of Victorian psychology, the fact that and the ways in which the intersections between psychology and literature and physiology and anatomy and philosophy were open and fluid, and this generalist culture is reflected and reinforced in the implications of Shakespearean drama by 19th century psychologists and alienists. So they could reach as wide an audience as possible and potentially also enhance the gravitas of their work. And I think invoking Shakespeare was a way of achieving greater legitimacy and cultural acceptance for psychology and alienism as a science. And thirdly, they cited Shakespeare's work, I'm suggesting, for its evidentiary value. He was considered an authority on the human mind and insanity, and psychologists exploited the particular reverence with which Shakespeare was held in the 19th century. There was a guiding assumption that if Shakespeare dramatized it, there must be some psychological truth to it. And the critic Benjamin Rice notes in his 2005 essay, Bardolatry in Bedlam, that Shakespeare was, for 19th century psychologists, the most prized piece of cultural capital, a figure not unlike George Washington or the Bible, whose word and legacy were meant to end arguments, but more often started them. And in part, it was also a way, I'm suggesting, to shore up the legitimacy of their medical treatment of the mentally ill. They tended to bend Shakespeare's characters to their will. British and American alienists argued that Shakespeare conveyed a system of psychological medicine that resembled the moral treatment for the insane which they institutionalized. Assiduously controlled environments these were, in which their status as medical experts held sway. And this involved conveniently overlooking moments in which Shakespeare perhaps made light of violent treatment of mentally ill in, for example, As You Like It and other plays. And I'll show some examples now of the ways in which Shakespeare and Hamlet in particular are cited by mid-19th century Anglophone psychologists, and consider whether Dickinson may have been aware of these. So first of all, phrenologists drew on his life and work. Hamlet holds the skull of York, which is of interest to phrenologists who place such great hermeneutic value on the cranium, believing that its bumps corresponded to the size of mental faculty. And Shakespeare, in the extant paintings we have of him, seems quite a cranial chap, and phrenologists exploited this and exhibited busts of Shakespeare in their offices, and argued that his prominent forehead supported their theory that the faculty of facility with language and literature was located at the forefront of the brain. And phrenology enjoyed enormous popularity during the first half of the 19th century in particular. And it's one of the contentions of my thesis that Dickinson must have been aware of this. Emerson discusses phrenology. Charlotte Bronte draws on it in Jane Eyre, for example. And my research suggests that Dickinson stayed near to phrenological offices when she was visiting Philadelphia in 1855. And these were the offices of Fowler and Wells. And they were the best known phrenologists in America. And they also owned a publishing house. And so this would have been Park Bookstore. And they were briefly the publishers of work by Dickinson's friend, Thomas Wentworth Dickinson, in 1853. The mental philosophy textbook that was used at Amherst Academy and Mount Holyoke during Dickinson's attendance, Thomas Upham's Elements of Mental Philosophy, cited Shakespeare on Mind and Madness. In the abridged textbook, he cited Lear raving on the heath, and in the unabridged version, the 2-volume, he cited Hamlet, and he wrote,
Adeline, your audio.
their invocations of Shakespeare was their insistence that Hamlet was not feigning madness. If Hamlet was to serve the purpose of shoring up medical theory, He had to be mad, so they tended to disambiguate him. And John Conolly, this was an English alienist, he wrote a book-length study of Hamlet, published in 1863, and he argued that Hamlet suffered from the curse of madness, a real and terrible malady. And his colleague in the States, Isaac Ray, he was a superintendent of what was then called a lunatic asylum. He was in fact president of the Association of all superintendents in America. And he published a paper on Shakespeare's delineations of insanity in 1847. And he praised what he called was Shakespeare's professional knowledge on the subject. And he argued that Hamlet's mental condition furnishes in abundance the characteristic symptoms of insanity. And Brigham, this was a colleague of Ray's, who was also a superintendent, he, at a lunatic asylum, he went as far as to argue that Shakespeare drew Hamlet from nature, not imagination. And he founded Brigham founded the American Journal of Insanity, and he wrote that Shakespeare must have seen Lear, Hamlet, and Ophelia. No reading could have enabled him to have given such complete and minute histories of them as cases of insanity. And Dickinson's father was a supporter of the asylum movement in America. We know that he encouraged Emily Dickinson to visit the lunatic asylum in Worcester in 1844. 1859 to 1864, and he corresponded with the superintendent there, Pliny Earle, who published a paper on the poetry of insanity, which referenced Shakespeare. And Earle was also frequently sending books to Edward Dickinson, and they kept in relatively close contact. And Earle claimed that poets were more prone to insanity than others. And he wrote of having seen many Ophelias walking down the corridors of his asylum. And other alienists, like Isaac Ray, who I cited earlier, he published work in the Atlantic Monthly, which Dickinson likely read since her family subscribed to it. So I'm suggesting that Dickinson was, at the very least, broadly aware of such areas of 19th century Anglophone psychology and alienism. And it is in this context that I want to look more closely at two of her poems that echo and allude to Hamlet. Firstly, I'll be arguing that where contemporary psychologists tended to draw generalizations about insanity from Shakespeare's play and to other insanity by presenting it as a deviation from normative mental behavior, Dickinson proceeds by humanizing and universalizing the mental states presented by Hamlet. And I'll be arguing in a second related point that these mental states, which she implies are universal, includes Hamlet's capacity, his flair, we might say, for self-dramatization and for theatricality. And these were aspects that contemporary psychologists commonly wanted to expunge in their discussions of Hamlet's behavior. So we can turn now to her quatrain poem, Sotto, Explore Yourself, which is dated to around 1865. Sotto, explore thyself, therein thyself shall find the undiscovered continent, no settler had the mind. Hernando de Soto, as many critics have pointed out, was a 16th century Spanish conquistador who undertook a vast expedition to North America and other continents to plunder gold and to colonize land. And Dickinson comically calls for him to explore the inner rather than the outer landscape. Explore thyself, her speaker exhorts. And with this exhortation, scholars have suggested that Dickinson revises Christ's physician, heal thyself, which is alluded to in the Gospel of Luke, and that she reworks the ancient Greek aphorism, know thyself, inscribed on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. And I would like to add to this that she is also reworking what was, you can see that here, the motto of the best known phrenologists in 19th century America, the Fowler brothers, Orson and Lorenzo Fowler, who had offices in major American cities and founded and edited, here what we can see is the American Phrenological Journal. And this was first published in 1838 and it continued publication until almost the end of the 19th century. And the two Fowler brothers, they were extraordinarily prolific. They authored many books on how to better know yourself phrenologically. And here we can see above the cranial map is their maxim, know thyself. And this appeared on each issue of the journal. And we can see also that they mapped the mind as a series of chambers, and they drew representative scenes within. To know yourself, according to phrenologists, was a matter of buying their maps of the mind and using their key to decipher how large each mental organ was, a deterministic, and although they suggested that these mental organs could be expanded, nevertheless a rather static model of the mind determined according to external corporeal signs. And Dickinson's transformation of their maxim cuts through their epistemic complacency. Explore thyself, she calls, and she emphasizes the mobility of mental activity. She makes a joke about those who were making efforts in effect to claim territorial rights to the mind, to colonize its landscape, those who were, perhaps we could say, psychological conquistadors who were searching for land and perhaps for gold. No settler has the mind, she writes, which puns on Sotto's efforts to grab land. And if we take the line of thinking about phrenology further, she implicitly critiques, we could say, what the American phrenologists displayed in their maps of the mind. And we can see servants and slaves carrying out tasks in some of these small chambers that they envisaged. And phrenologists were not simply paralleling colonialism, colonization. By mapping the mind, they were actively reinforcing structures and practices of colonization. As the critic James Poskett has discussed in his recent book, Materials of the Mind, the American Phrenological Journal was propped up by the profits of slaveholders. So Dickinson turns our attention inwards to what might be discovered when we venture within, alone, without external map or compass. And in doing so, she invokes Hamlet. In fact, she deliberately miscites his to be or not to be soliloquy at the beginning of Act 3, when he contemplates how to act after learning of his uncle's betrayal. Ruminating on the desire to die, to sleep, Hamlet expresses dread about what he calls that something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne, i.e. from whose boundary, no traveller returns. And Dickinson's remediation emphasizes the expansive reaches of interior self-discovery as far and wide as a continent. And the apparent instability of mental activity, no settler had the mind, puns on the notion of mental activity as unsettled. Her speaker plays with and reasserts the ambiguity of Hamlet's mental state. Does the mind have no settlers because it is mad, because it is unsettled, or because mental activity is profoundly protean, mobile, and ungraspable? Dickinson is allowing for an ambiguity about mental state here that contemporary psychologists invoking Hamlet largely sought to suppress. She also seems to imply, by referencing the Sotto who died during his American expedition, and by invoking Hamlet's soliloquy on death, that ruminating on death is perhaps unavoidable and inevitable terrain for explorers of the interior. With a playful tone, she destabilizes the tendency of contemporary psychologists to other meditation on death as a sign of disturbance and insanity, and she implies that any distinction between what might be called a mad mind and a mind of mobile mental activity is far less clear and discernible than psychologists were propagating. And I'd like to consider now the argument of contemporary psychologists that Hamlet was not feigning, and to consider this in the context of another poem by Dickinson, which invokes the same soliloquy, and that is The Heart Asks Pleasure First. And this is my last slide. The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then, if it should be the will of its inquisitor, the privilege to die. Here Dickinson echoes Hamlet's to be or not to be speech in three ways, I'm suggesting. Like Shakespeare, she pairs to sleep and to die in her second stanza. She also suggests that sleep, rather than bringing relief, seems to lead to fantasies that we're being tortured in some kind of inquisition. And thirdly, she suggests suicide through her reference to the privilege or the liberty and the luxury to die. And these aspects recall Prince Hamlet's rhetoric when, seeming to waver between inaction and suicide, he exclaims, "'Tis a consummation, devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come." Dickinson draws our attention to what contemporary psychologists and alienists were reluctant to discuss, namely Hamlet's theatricality, his capacity for self-dramatization. Shakespeare shows Hamlet's friendly relationship with the players and even implies that he is a playwright. Hamlet directs the players in how to act in front of Claudius. Hamlet tells Horatio he will put an antic disposition on, and he tells his mother that he is only mad in craft. And in this play, Shakespeare repeatedly asks us to think about action in terms of acting and make-believe. And it is worth noting in this context that the edition of Shakespeare's plays that Edward Dickinson bought for his family emphasized theatrical production. And here we can see that the editor, Charles Knight, he included a drawing of a very well-known 19th century actor, John Philip Kemble. And this is a drawing based on a painting by Sir Thomas Lawrence. And I'm suggesting that Dickinson in his poem, like Shakespeare, is interested in our capacity for self-dramatization and for theatricality. Her speaker implies that rather than accept that life is painful and that the heart will suffer, we strive to amplify and embellish our experiences by groping after celebrated artistic representations of suffering. We want to believe that someone can excuse us from pain, and when those little anodynes that deaden suffering fail to work wonders, and sleep does not dispel unwanted feeling, we seem to escape into melodramatic fantasies that an inquisitor is persecuting us. And she's punning here on inquisitor as one who inquires, but also one who persecutes. And her Webster Dictionary of 1844 acknowledged the etymological link between these two terms. The reference to anodynes and the dragging anaphona of and then, intimate that our performances of suffering, our efforts to dramatize and embellish our suffering by appealing to the work of Shakespeare, for example, can be rather boring and monotonous. Where alienists like Emily Brigham maintained that Shakespeare drew from nature, not the imagination, as I mentioned earlier, Dickinson shines a light on Hamlet's rhetorical prowess and his self-theatricality. She implies that our mental activity is not fully separable from our capacity to dramatize and our rehearsals of pain and suffering. Where psychological theorists and alienists sought to separate Hamlet from the textual environments in which he was embedded and to generalize about mental states on a detextualized basis, Dickinson articulates and emphasizes that our experiences of suffering are not fully separable from, and indeed are shaped by, structured by, popular textual representations like like Shakespeare's, but also Hamlet. Through these invocations of Hamlet, she implies that there can be no mental life without drama, without instability, without vacillation. And she suggests here finally that yes, Hamlet wavered for all of us, but we are also still, year after year, in each retelling, wavering for him. Thank you.
Yeah. Philip, I think, is here. Yes?
Yes, I am here indeed. Thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Vanessa, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you all for joining me here in my small basement office. I didn't think we'd all fit, but here we are. Let me... So thanks again for being here. And I want to do two things. First, I want to tell a story about Shakespeare. And I want to focus on especially Shakespeare's interest in rendering inner experience, and in particular, the inner experience of thought, of thinking something through. And I really love some of the resonances with Elizabeth's talk yesterday, with Vanessa's talk just now about Hamlet. And in terms, when I get to talking about the lyric a little bit, also Adeline's keynote yesterday. And if you know Shakespeare's work, you know where this thread leads. It leads to those amazing soliloquies, some of which Vanessa just pointed to, when in Hamlet, when he is on stage alone with his thoughts, thinking things through in real time, making discoveries, seemingly right before our eyes on stage. So we'll get there. We'll start with Shakespeare. And then in the second half, I want to turn to Dickinson and ask, with all of that in mind, with Shakespeare's discoveries in mind, what comes into view? What, with thinking as our lens to look at the poems, what do we notice? And I'm going to share my email address at the end. I'm also easy enough to find. These are things I'm really excited to talk and think more about. So I love to continue the conversation beyond this occasion. And just to be clear, my claim is not that Dickinson learned this from Shakespeare. Rather that I think on the evidence of their text, I think what we can say is that both artists share a deep interest in the inner workings of the human being, of the mind, the brain, and each in their own way, each in the context of their own genres, really make maybe parallel discoveries, is maybe how I would say it. So the story with Shakespeare, let's see here. The story with Shakespeare really should begin before he was born, with some of the plays he would have seen as a young man, the morality plays, upward through Christopher Marlowe's work around him. I'm going to leap right to the work where I think we really see this phenomenon come into full being in his work, which is his play Richard II. And in particular, I want to look at a soliloquy that Richard has in Act 5. I put it here on the screen. I forbid you from reading it all. I just want you to get a sense of the lengths to which Richard goes as he encounters this moment in the play. He is about to be murdered. We know that because we've seen the murderers have been given their orders. They are on the way. And Richard begins by saying, I have been studying how I may compare this prison where I live unto the world. And for because the world is populous, and here is not a creature but myself, I cannot do it. Yet I'll hammer it out. And it's that last line, I'll hammer it out, that I want to sort of tune in on. Richard is not only thinking, he's aware of his thinking. He's essentially watching himself think. And that last line is, it's actually reminiscent of moments in Marlowe where characters will come close to a turn inward. But in Marlowe, they always veer off. One critic accuses Marlowe of, given the chance of having his protagonist alone with his thoughts on stage, he happily and quickly brings someone else on stage. Whereas Shakespeare, and in this case, Richard II, really embraces the chance to think something through. So we are witness to his thinking. What's amazing to me is that after promising to think it through in another line, he launches into 23 or 24 lines where the pronoun I doesn't even appear. So we have a front row seat to Richard's thinking. He himself has a front row seat to his own thinking. Thinking is happening on stage. Having conjured his thoughts and set them in motion, we all sit and watch them happen. And when the I returns, it returns with a sort of stunning insight. I'll just read this next part. Thus play I in one person many people, and none contented. Sometimes am I king, then treasons make me wish myself a beggar, and so I am. Then crushing penury persuades me I was better when a king, then am I kinged again. And by think that I am unkinged by Bolingbroke, and straight am nothing. But whate'er I be, and this is the turn I think is interesting. Up until then, he's been describing his thinking, characterizing his thinking, but then he has this insight. But whate'er I be, nor I nor any man that but man is, with nothing shall be pleased till he be eased with being nothing. This for Richard is a discovery. I mean, he's been holding off this realization for the entirety of the play, something he's never understood before. And he's come to understand it in the course of this speech. And what he understands is that a human being can never be content unless they are content with nothing, which is to say, not with being king, just with being a person. So we're only halfway through this sort of amazing monologue. But what I want to emphasize is Richard is quite evidently thinking something for the first time, which is to say Shakespeare has given us a glimpse of how thinking happens over the course of time. And if the glimpse seems small to us, it's because we're spoiled by the later soliloquies of Shakespeare. We're spoiled by having read James Joyce and Freud and Woolf and James. We have the phrase stream of consciousness, but of course, Shakespeare did not have it. And what I want to do as we turn now to Dickinson is to think about, with the idea of hammering it out as our lens, as it were, how might that enliven our readings of some of the poems? To be sure, I'm not the first person to link Dickinson with thinking. There's a lot of really wonderful work on this topic. I mentioned just a few of the critics here who have sort of mentioned this or explored this. Chris Miller writes at one point, Dickinson's poems are process or thinking poems, riddles of relationship. Erica Shore has a wonderful essay in which he describes how Dickinson often sets up an exploratory mode of discourse, the mind thinking, not the mind having thought. The effect of Dickinson's voice is to pull us into the moment to experience Dickinson as thought. I think that says it in a beautiful way. And Jed Detman, of course, has a whole entire book about Dickinson and thinking. At one point, he's talking partly about the poems that describe thinking as much as how they embody thinking. Dickinson's poems represent thinking as rapid, uncontrollable, or self-contesting. So we can start with this example. We give a few examples of what I'm talking about and how it might play out. This is the example from which I take my title, the first 4 lines of a longer poem. What would I give to see his face? I'd give my life, of course, but that is not enough. Stop just a minute, let me think. So it's a pretty straightforward example. The poem essentially pauses in the process of its unfolding. And actually, I would say it registers the present tense moment of thinking in at least 2 ways. The first is that that 4th line, stop just a minute, let me think. The gesture is something like, I can't even continue this poem. We can't even get to the next stanza until I have a second to think, right? In the fabric of the poem, in the unfolding, in our experience of the poem, a pause is sort of enacted. But note also, just above that in line 2, I'd give my life, of course. With the dash, there's a thought-filled pause and a repetition. And at a moment like this, we feel the language and the thinking coming into being as we make our way through the poem. And to be really precise, the feeling, I think, is that when this line begins, the full thought is not that yet there. That when the utterance I'd give is uttered, the rest of the sentence is not yet there. And there is a moment of thought encapsulated in that dash when the thought comes into being. Here's a poem I'm sure none of you have ever seen before. I'll read it quickly, and I want to talk about one line in particular. And I guess I would ask, maybe think about the verb tenses here as we move through the beginning of this poem. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. So it's a crime to, I'm hearing a bit of an echo, is that just me?
I just heard that bit of echo. It just started and very effectively, as you said, or rather, he passed us. But I don't. I'll let you know if it continues.
Okay, I'll keep going. Or rather, he passed us. So it's a kind of a crime to bring up this poem, this great poem, for such a small point. Actually, it's not a very small point. Just note that moment of equivocation. Robert Reisbook calls this moment the or, calls it a moment of self-correction. Even that line is in the past tense, right? Even the line, or rather, he passed us. But the or registers a moment in the present tense to get the language right. The story is past, the experience is past, but we feel that language coming into being. The or reminds us, or even insists, that we register the present tense effort to find the right words. And in some ways, this cuts to the heart of the matter, I think, because what is thought? Well, thought is a lot of things, but among other things, what is thought but conjuring the language you need in a particular moment of experience in time? So there are a number of other poems where the or is actually elided. So for example, if you know the poem, "'Twas like a maelstrom with a notch," I forget the number, but there's a poem where as I read it, there are 3 different attempts to describe a situation and to sort of describe what it was like. And it's as if there was a silent or in between each attempt, or a silent stop, let me think, between each attempt. Or to refer back to Adeline's really amazing keynote yesterday, there was a moment of not silence between each attempt, which I would say sits on the threshold of speech between various attempts. And importantly, out of that not silence that Adeline described so beautifully yesterday, out of that not silence comes a thought, comes a new thought. My next example comes from the fact that a fair number of Dickinson's poems begin in the past tense or in some indeterminate tense and end very much in the present tense. And I want to just go through this example really quickly to see what this might reveal about the kind of lyric Dickinson is writing. And this is a relatively early poem, which I think is interesting to think about the evolution of her lyric. Some of these things are in place very early on in her development as a poet. Heart not so heavy as mine, wending late home, as it passed my window, whistled itself a tune, a careless snatch, a ballad, a ditty of the street, yet to my irritated ear, an anodyne so sweet. It was as if a bobolink sauntering this way, caroled and paused and caroled, then bubbled slow away. It was as if a chirping brook upon a dusty way set bleeding feet to minuets without the knowing why. So we're completely in the past tense up until now. It feels like a memory and only a memory. But the poem goes on, tomorrow night will come again, perhaps weary and sore. Ah, bugle by my window, I pray you pass once more. This poem essentially yields itself to the present tense thinking that accompanies the telling of the story. So there's a lot going on here. There's apostrophe, there's a direct address, there's the future tense. There's a lot happening poetically at the final 4 lines of the poem. But fundamentally, what I would say is that by the time the poem ends, it reveals itself as a moment of present tense thinking. We understand, in fact, that's what it's been doing all along. It's a moment of present tense thinking that just happens to begin with a backward glance, a memory. And this kind of thing happens so effortlessly and without any fanfare in Dickinson's work, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, that it sometimes just seems to me that Dickinson is simply assuming the present tenseness or the present tense thinkingness, if I can borrow a few dashes, of her poems. She's a bit like Richard, hammering it out. She's content to simply present the thinking as it happens, or she's choosing to craft poems that in some sense present a process of thinking. That may be a better way of saying it. I think reading the poems as moments of thinking can also help us avoid some problems or avert some kinds of annoyances. And so I don't mean to go back in time too far in Dickinson scholarship, but I did want to, this is where I think a certain thread begins when Charles Anderson writes of Dickinson's poetry that not 1 in 10 poems fulfills the brilliant promise of the opening words. And Blackmer writes, the movement of the parts of the poems is downward and towards disintegration of the effect wanted. This is, I realized a long time ago in terms of Dickinson scholarship years. But there's a critique alive today in poetry of poems that don't fulfill their opening promise. And that faults Dickinson in particular for sometimes being repetitive, for getting distracted. This is said sometimes of the definition poems, for example. On a related note, my students will sometimes observe that a Dickinson poem seems to take a left turn or a right turn or something, especially towards the end. I think that sounds exactly right. And I don't want to argue I certainly don't want to argue with Anderson or Blackmer or anybody about interpretation of a poem, but I do want to say that this kind of thing doesn't bother me as a reader of Dickinson. My view is that Dickinson is simply crafting a different kind of poem. And the difference has everything to do with bringing to life not the completed thought you had before you began, but the step-by-step process of moving through something without necessarily knowing what comes next, right? In fact, I would say Dickinson goes out of her way at times to create poems and to create that feeling of not knowing what comes next. That seems to be, to me, an inherent part of the kind of lyric she comes to write and then thrives in writing. And I actually like poems. I mean, there's nothing wrong with poems that fulfill their promise, to use that little bit of language. And Dickinson writes those kinds of poems. I think a poem like Hope is the Thing with Feathers strikes me as a poem that begins something and it follows it through. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that this is a different kind of poem, I would argue. The way I see it, as long as our thinking can get distracted or take a left turn or get pulled in some direction, then why can't our poems as well, especially poems that set out in some way to capture that aspect of our experience? And then I guess I'll say one last thing before I end. It wouldn't be fair to talk about poetics and not talk at least a little bit about the dashes. And so I wanted to return to this brief couplet. What would I give to see his face? I'd give my life, of course. So with the dashes, we need to be careful because they can do many things. I think I saw Paul Crumley here. He identified a great number of things that the dash might do in a poem, and scholars have explored this at length. They can introduce a pause, they can hold things together, hold things apart at the same time. Dickinson also uses pairs of dashes to emphasize a word. And we know this because sometimes she will put a piece of language between dashes, and then when she copies the poem, it might be underlined instead. So clearly what she's doing to her mind is she is emphasizing it in some way. And so these would seem to be two very different functions of a pause. And to me, it raises a really interesting question that I'm still thinking about. What exactly is the difference between pausing in order to emphasize a word and pausing while you think and conjure that next word, right? They seem like different things altogether. But I want to emphasize something that they have in common, which is that in both cases, the moment of hesitation signals a heightened feeling of thoughtfulness towards the language itself. And in both cases, in the fabric of the poem, intense attention is brought to bear on the language being offered. Whether you're pausing to emphasize or pausing to find that next word, you are attending to the language as it unfolds. So on this view, dashes and commas, underlining, exclamation marks, what they share, I would argue, is a heightened attention to the finding, or conjuring is maybe a nicer word, and the delivering of language. And at such moments, and there are tons in Dickinson's poetry, and there are tons in poetry, we experience the language being shaped before us, which is to say, I would say for this talk, that we bear witness to a kind of thinking happening in the poem. So I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that this is the way to read Dickinson's poems or all of her poems or the best way. But I do think that this approach, seeing some of the poems as present tense moments of thinking, can ease us out of the mode of trying to get the poem's meaning or interpreting it in some ways, which is very useful in the classroom, because it can ease us out of that and ease us into a mode of experiencing a poem as it unfolds, as it spills down the page and through time. A moment when something happens in the moment that we share with the poem as we read it or as we hear it. And I guess the last thing I'll say is Dickinson didn't need to invent this. I think Shakespeare did. I'm not really knowledgeable about Shakespeare, maybe to say this, but I'll just say it. I think it's pretty clear that if you read forward towards Shakespeare, the morality plays, Christopher Marlowe and others, it seems clear to me that Shakespeare discovered, developed, and then really exploited this inward, the skill of a character going inward. And we see that come to full bloom in the soliloquies in Hamlet and other plays. Dickinson didn't need to invent it because this is a dimension of lyric that's been a part of the lyric tradition since the beginning. I mean, you can find examples of this in Sappho, I would argue, and many poets in between. But she did need to sort of lean into it and to activate it. And I would suggest that Dickinson does just that, that she makes many poems that come to life if we think of them as moments of thought, of language being found kind of seemingly right before our eyes. And I think I will stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful talks, really superb. And I think there are going to be quite a few questions. Let's see. I think I see Anne.
Thank you. This is to Philip. I wonder if it had occurred to you, or if it occurred to anyone during that presentation, there was a moment of resonance of the type that so interests Elizabeth, Sagaser, and myself, that the speech of King Richard has a kind of parallel in that poem, A Heart Not So Heavy as Mine. The poem speaks of the bugle, the music outside the window, and Richard is, right after that speech that you quoted, the stable groom comes along, the humble serving man who is playing music outside the window, gets his attention, and then they begin to speak. And it's that last moment, the human compassion that Richard receives before his death. And that just struck me very much, that poem of Dickinson's went so well with that bit of Shakespeare.
Yeah, I think that's really true. It's one of the things that in the longer version of this talk, which I gave to my cat like yesterday, which was 4 hours long, she heard it. But I think you raises an interesting point, which is that as you go, one way to really bring to life an inner experience is a provocation from beyond. And so, you know, Shakespeare giving Richard hears this music, and it's really a very moving moment because it immediately draws him out of his own world. But he returns to the world, having benefited from the thinking he's been able to do, right? So I think those moments of, and Dickinson hearing the poem, hearing the song as well, are just wonderful moments of when the thinking is put into some kind of broader context, which I think is really, really important. So yeah, it was a wonderful, wonderful insight.
Yes, yes. Jeffrey.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to tell you both that I found your talks thrilling and wonderful, and I'm happier now than I have been all day today. I just have one little question for Vanessa. It may be that you mentioned this, Vanessa, and if you did, then we could just forget this question. But did you address the rhyme in Sotto, Explore Thyself, which is just this one little short meter stanza, 6-6-8-6, with this real strong rhyme between find and mind? I'm not sure you incorporate, I didn't hear you refer to the rhyme of find with mind. And Dickinson seems to be saying in a way that the mind cannot really be found in definitive terms. But at any rate, did you include that? And if you didn't, do you have a notion as to how that might fit into the rhyme might fit into your reading?
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. That's a good question. No, I didn't refer to that. I think I'm not quite sure how that incorporates in my argument, but I think it's an ironic reference to not being, or maybe it does fit in, that I was talking about the ungraspability of mental activity that Dickinson refers to, and find is find and mind reinforces that, but it's also part of the joke that she's making, isn't it? That part of the irony of cutting through that that epistemic maybe arrogance or immodesty of contemporary psychologists like the phrenologists. So yeah, that's how I do.
Well, perhaps you might include it some way. It might strengthen your reading at some point, or perhaps not. It's just a thought. Thank you very much to both of you for your lovely talks.
I like that, Jeff. It's just a thought. Any other thoughts or questions? Eliza.
Hi, thank you both for those wonderful, provocative thoughts. Vanessa, I'm very excited about your talk because I'm thinking along similar lines in part about the relationship of poetry and psychology, the emergence of psychology as a separate discipline in the 19th century. So of course, I'm thinking about you seem to be suggesting that a lot of things triangulated through Shakespeare. So one of them seems to be that the materiality of the mind is something that Dickinson is challenging. Is that correct? The ways that psychologists in the period are imagining a physical location for thinking.
Do you want me to respond now, or do you want to?
Yeah, I just want to make sure
No,
that I understand that.
No, I'm not saying that. I mean, in these poems, it's maybe not as, that part of my argument and my thesis isn't as explicit as elsewhere. So I do look in my thesis at how she relates to physiological psychology, which is of course a major part of psychology. In the mid-19th century, you have George Henry Lewis, George Eliot's partner, working as an amateur physiologist and psychologist, and you have Alexander Bain. Melanie Hubbard wrote on this recently, and I am saying that she incorporates and converses with those, with the physiological psychology that was emerging at that time, just not in these poems here specifically.
Okay, and in okay, I see. So I'm wondering, you use the word psychologist, but psychologist is not a word that is used in the same way in the 19th century, and there are all these different strains: the phrenology, the mesmerists, the physiognomists, the mental healers, all these different things. Where would and there's a shift from thinking about the words from mental philosophy to psychology, and psyche to psychology. So I'm just wondering, in this messy landscape of thinking about thinking and its relation to mind, body, and emotion, which is where I would locate the rise of psychology. Where do you think Dickinson locates herself? I know that's a big and general question, but the field is such a mess in the 19th century, a productive, creative, exciting mess. And I'm wondering if you could speak to where you see Dickinson engaging most powerfully.
That's very difficult to summarize, because I think there's so many poems that take her thinking about psychology in a different direction. Maybe I can just first address your first point about psychology. It could be argued that that is anachronistic to use that term, but this is the very century in which psychology came about, and you could retrospectively understand the mental philosophy teaching that she had as a part of that emerging psychology. It did contribute to it, just when she was writing these poems, there was a book released, Shakespeare and Psychology, by John Bucknill. There were 3 books writing about that. So it wasn't as maybe as late a term as we sometimes tend to assume. In terms of your second point, where would I situate Dickinson? I think, like I say, it is very varied. With regard to phrenology, I think you could say in such famous poems as The Brain is Wider Than the Sky, that she is reworking these spatializations of the mind that the phrenologists were proposing, and actually inverting them and expanding them. You could also say there is a Blossom of the Brain talks about chambers in the mind, for example. So she does seem to be aware of phrenological ideology and works against it, for example. I do think she's very interested in the physiological, the fact that the mind was becoming more well, it's being understood in a more physiological way, and that the interactions between the body and mind were such a fundamental part of psychological thought in that period. I do think she's very interested in that, and she gets a lot of that through George Eliot, for example. She may have also read George Henry Lewes, or also in the Atlantic Monthly there were various articles in that period. So I suppose if you were going to push me, I would say that maybe she is most interested in the physiological questions.
The brain versus the mind.
The
not verses, the mind.
Not verses, but the interaction in mental experience.
Yeah.
The interaction between.
Dan, I know you had your hand up for a while, and then we seen.
No, that's it. My question got so complicated, I didn't know how to articulate it. Please move on to Lucien.
Okay, so you kept thinking is what happened. You had a question and you kept thinking, and it got too complicated. Lucien, please.
Okay. So I will start my questions first, and then feel free to come back So I enjoy both talks very much, and I have two questions, one for each. The first one for Vanessa, I'm thinking about the part you briefly mentioned that psychologists are also searching for therapies, and do they also use Shakespeare as a way to deal with this issue of madness or insanity that you come across? And then my question for Philip is more, I really enjoy what you talk about, this idea of thoughts and how it's a way to, the pause is a way to move forward as well. But it kind of also remind me of how Dickinson sometimes has this strange act of afterthoughts, as if this kind of afterthoughts are a way to erase what happened before. And I think you briefly mentioned this idea of like her looking backwards, the backward glance as well. So I guess just, yeah, wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more on that. Thanks.
Should I go first, or do you want to go first, Philip?
Go ahead, Vanessa.
Okay. So if I understood your question correctly, it's about whether Shakespeare was actually used in therapies for the mentally ill and for in treatment.
Yeah, I was wondering
Yeah.
if those sociologists were keen to cure the mind and the right.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting area. Of course, there was this rise of the moral treatment. So in the asylums, in which Edward Dickinson was also involved in, supported this movement, part of the moral treatment was reading and performing plays. And they, for example, actually the murder scene in Hamlet, this is maybe very surprising, but in the asylum in Fisherman Asylum in Britain in 1857, they actually reenacted the murder scene in Hamlet. So they were actively drawing on Shakespeare at that time as part of the moral treatment for the insane.
So interesting, thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate the question about what are often called the after poems or after resonance. And there's a lot of really wonderful writing on this. And there's also a similar, maybe opposite group of poems that are kind of threshold poems that are on the verge of something happening. So A Wife at Daybreak, I Will Be, for example. And I think what's amazing about those poems is they are, as you say, either looking back or looking forward in some sense. But I think they seem to me always very successfully ground themselves in the present moment of trying to find the language for that experience, right? So I guess that's the distinction that I would draw. They're very much of their own moment. They don't only look forward. And even when they are in the future tense or in the past tense, the kinds of gestures I'm talking about betray or reveal or convey the effort to find the language that is needed. And I'm just really struck by that as I was talking before. I was just thinking, it really is that searching for the right words is such a intimate inner experience that we have, and that time and time again, that's the experience that I find being brought to life in Dickinson. And so my interest is in the poetics, the kind of mechanics of the poem. How does that magic happen? Like how is that happening? How is that experience being created in the context of a lyric? So.
Yeah, I'm thinking also about what you said, how that kind of way of thinking is some kind of speech act, as if writing is thinking, is some kind of performance. Thanks.
Yeah. I think there's something really. Erica Shore has a wonderful essay talking about the difference between speaking and writing, and there was a lot of rhetorical textbooks about talking about how to write for speech and how that plays out. So I think there is, and Emerson has a wonderful quotation when he talks about how he describes a good friend or a close friend. I forget exactly, something like a close friend is someone who I can think with out loud. And so I think some of the distinctions that we draw may be less firm or maybe intentionally overlaid in some of the way 19th century writers are going. It's not really my area of expertise, but in some of the ways that 19th century writers were thinking about finding language for experience, speech, thought. So.
Wonderful, thank you.
David is waiting, and then David and then Ellie. So Vanessa, you may have had your hand up briefly. Okay, David.
I thought these were two great talks and very stimulating. I just want to make one brief comment, is that I was thinking about Dickinson as a poet, but also a visual artist in her manuscripts. And that's, the visual artist is a little bit like that, is putting some stuff on the canvas and then seeing what it proposes. And I think she operates a bit like that. And also her handwriting, where an A is a little bit like a whirlpool or something. I think that is kind of pulling the like thinking does, it pulls the thought into different directions. So that was my comment.
Yeah, great.
I want to reiterate great praise for these two presentations and all the ones that have come before. And I love that you, Philip, quoted Erica Scheuer's exploratory conversation essay that she has. I think that is really wonderful. And what comes to my mind is Richard Wilbur's poem Mind. It's called Mind, in which he offers a metaphor. And then in the middle of that metaphor, he says, and has this simile alike perfection. And then he turns around and starts a whole new one in the middle of the poem. And of course, he's one of the great discussers of Dickinson. So I see a line there going on, and the fact that is about the mind. And that in the middle of it, he stops and says, wait a minute, is this the right metaphor? No, I'll start all over again. It's kind of wonderful. It's the kind of thing that as you say, and as Erica says, Dickinson does do right in the middle of something. She'll turn around and switch it. It's the reason we love her.
Yeah, it's really exciting, Philip. I don't see any hands, so I'm just going to add. I put one example in, but there's so many examples in Shakespeare's sonnets of this also, and it's almost like the sonnet form is a tool for thinking. And so the Shakespearean sonnet, you have your 3 quatrains. Each quatrain is almost like a new stab at it, a new chance to think it through, and then that afterthought idea. Then the couplet is that idea, but to see that kind of the idea of the or carrying the present tense. I really love that. And it made me think of I put one example in the chat that I love, where he goes through a first quatrain. Thy gift, thy tables are within my brain, full charactered with lasting memory, which shall above the idle rank remain beyond all date, even to eternity. And then he's completely unsatisfied with using a sort of euphemistic term, eternity. And so he thinks, well, what do I really mean by that? So he uses that or, the Dickinson or at the least, so long as brain and heart have faculty by nature to subsist. All he can even mean by eternity is my mortal life. You're only going to live in my memory as long as my brain and heart have faculty by nature to subsist. But I just think it's another resonance between Dickinson and Shakespeare that's really terrific. All right, any other thoughts, Liza?
I'm sorry, I'm just so, the talks are so generative, and maybe I've formulated another question, at least enough to begin to ask it, as long as there's time. So Vanessa, once again, you talk about the externalization of suffering through a melodramatization. Is that correct? That's part of what you're thinking about with Dickinson. I have to say that I'm hard of hearing, so I'm trying to get things right through the transcriptions and through other means.
I don't know whether I didn't use the word externalization. I was talking about theatricality.
Theatricality, right? Okay, so I associate that with externalization. You said that she's melodramatizing suffering. Is that right? In her poems, performing suffering melodramatically.
No, I'm saying in the poem that I was discussing that she's making kind of she's using Hamlet to making a subtle behavioral critique that we tend to embellish such experiences by groping after celebrated models.
To do those by groping after celebrated models. Okay, all right, great. Do you think that there is a way of poetry serves, I'll just say this, that poetry seems to me to serve as a way to share psychological states. So in that way, you're taking your interior and you are performing it for others, which seems to me would serve a kind of function in terms of the development of the concept of psychology in the 19th century. That you're sharing a model, not just of thinking, but of thinking tied to emotion and to the body. So, I associate theatricality with that, with sharing and disseminating modes of modes of being. I tend to think historically. So once again, I guess I'm asking you if any of that sounds like it plugs into the kinds of ideas that you've shared about Dickinson. I guess I'm asking about the reasons for the critique.
You mean why share observation about the psychology of others or the psychology of oneself? Why share it? Well, I might.
Why circulate that?
Circulate that. It's difficult to know what her personal motivation might have been for that. I think.
Yeah.
What might have motivated that particular poem? I can't say that, but I do agree with what you were saying, that poetry is in this case a sharing of a model and a dissemination of modes of being. I agree with that. I didn't get whether you were saying that it's always that. This is why you come to poetry in the first place, or whether Dickinson is doing that especially. I didn't quite understand.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we are 1 minute past 12:20, which is our supposed ending time. So I think we can again applaud these superb talks. And